It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Last year, I completed the so-called Universal Classic Monster Cycle, but to be completely and totally honest, there are two movies that I don't typically include as part of that cycle, despite them almost always being included in box sets of those Universal Classic Monsters movies. So after the successes of Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man, Universal was riding high. They were producing well-shot, well-acted, and pretty spooky horror films. By the time 1935 rolled around, things were a little bit different. The Hays Code was in effect by then, so the overt god complexes of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man were no longer acceptable. The undertones of sex seen in Dracula or The Mummy was no longer acceptable either. Now, granted, 1936's Dracula's Daughter would sneak in a whole hell of a lot of lesbian undertones, as well as worship of death, but I digress. In 1935, Universal was still pushing on with their monsters. In April of that year came The Bride of Frankenstein, made by James Whale, the director of the original Frankenstein, as well as The Invisible Man. 3 weeks later, Universal followed that up with the movie that we'll be talking about today, Werewolf of London. Werewolf of London is often overshadowed by 1941's The Wolfman, and that's probably pretty understandable. That said, Werewolf of London would inspire some other things, like the song Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon, and it would inspire American Werewolf in London, and there would also be a video game released in 1987 called Werewolves of London that was based directly on this movie. But The Wolfman is one of the greatest of the Universal classics, but Werewolf of London was the studio's first attempt at making a werewolf movie. And I think it's pretty successful. It sometimes is called the first werewolf film, and that's mostly true. To be honest, it's the first feature-length werewolf film. The first werewolf film, if you're curious, was a short in 1913 called The Werewolf, and that was about a Navajo woman becoming a timber wolf. But Werewolf of London was intended to star Boris Karloff in the lead as Dr. Glendon, and supporting him would have bela Lugosi as Dr. Yagami. However, Karloff could not make this film as it was being filmed at the exact same time as Bride of Frankenstein was being shot. So that led to Universal essentially dumping both actors. Now, the year before, Karloff and Lugosi had starred in The Black Cat together and would star in The Raven together in the very same year as this film. So I don't know if they didn't want to continue with the casting of one without the other or what, but either way, they were both dumped. Now, in their places were Henry Hull, a stage actor who would later on appear in mostly supporting roles in over 70 films over the course of almost 50 years, and he's playing Glendon, and Warner Oland, who was most famous for playing Charlie Chan at the time. And yes, Oland was a Swede who just happened to have vaguely Asian looks, but he would be in the role of Dr. Yagami. Now, playing the female lead in this is Valerie Hobson. Now, she's fresh off her appearance as Elizabeth in The Bride of Frankenstein. She wasn't even 18 years old when either film was in production. So, that movie actually released 5 days after her 18th birthday, and she went straight from bride to werewolf. And interesting story about Hobson, she was a key figure in one of the greatest British political scandals of the 20th century. She was married in 1954 to Brigadier John Profumo, a member of Parliament, and she quit acting shortly after that marriage. 9 years later, Profumo's career in Parliament ended when it came out that he had lied to the House of Commons over an affair that he had with a woman named Christine Keeler. Hobson would end up standing by his side and do a lot of charity work over the course of the next 35 years until she ultimately passed away. A movie was made in 1989 about Christine Keeler and these affairs that was called Scandal. Hobson was portrayed by Deborah Grant, and John Perfumo was played by Ian McKellen. And Joanne Whalley starred as Keeler. But let's talk about Werewolf of London. World-renowned English botanist Wilfred Glendon is in Tibet, and he's looking for a rare plant called the Marifasa lumina lupina, which does not take nourishment from the sun like most plants, but from the moon. And he's warned that it is something that might not be worth seeking out. According to local legend, the plant is found in a valley that is lousy with quote-unquote demons. Now, he doesn't quite respect the legend. I mean, after all, he's a scientist and an adventurer. So he and his friend and assistant, Hugh, journey into the valley. Hugh claims at one point that something was holding his feet, and it wasn't allowing him to move forward behind his friend Wilfred, but he ultimately overcomes that and carries on. Wilfred himself runs into something of an invisible barrier before being able to press on through sheer willpower. Wilfred finds the plant that he's looking for, but he's suddenly attacked by some sort of hairy beast that's humanoid in nature while he digs the plant up to collect the specimen. Now, Wilfred is ultimately beaten by the creature before stabbing it with a knife. Upon returning to London, Wilfred keeps the specimen in his lab and has a concoction that replicates moonlight so it can hopefully bloom. Wilfred and his wife Lisa host a party for the Botanical Society. Wilfred meets an old boyfriend of Lisa's named Paul, who is currently visiting London. Paul talks about how exciting his life is to the point that he asks for nothing else. And that's a comment that Wilfred takes near offense to over this guy's cavalier playboy life. And he also meets Dr. Yagami from the University of Carpathia. He says that he and Wilfred met once before in Tibet in the dark. But Yagami is very interested and impressed in finding out that Wilfred successfully returned with a sample of the Marifasa lumina lupina. All of Yagami's samples died on his return trip to London. In private, Yagami talks about 2 cases of werewolfery in London, and they've contracted this condition from the bite of another werewolf. Now, the plant is a temporary antidote to the condition, and later Wilfred notices his hand get really hairy when he sticks it underneath the light that replicates moonlight. And out of curiosity, he pricks the top of his hand with a piece of the Marifasa stem, and it reverses the condition. And later, Yagami asks again for 2 blossoms of the flower to save 2 souls during this period of the full moon. Wilfred denies the request, and Yagami leaves after warning that the werewolf instinctively destroys what it loves best. Now, while Wilfred studies up on lycanthropy, Yagami steals 2 blossoms, and before leaving for a party, Lisa turns on a light that Wilfred basically scolds her to turn off as quickly as possible, is saying that it hurts his eyes because he's put some medicine in them. But after she leaves, Wilfred's cat soon starts hissing and swatting at him, and soon he transforms into a werewolf. He goes to his lab to obtain a blossom, but finds that they are gone. And he remembers what Yagami says about destroying those that he loves, and what he read about a werewolf needing to kill someone each night or they can't transform back. So he heads to the socialite party that Lisa is at to kill her, but Lisa's aunt screams upon seeing him, causing him to flee, so he instead finds a woman on the street to kill in replacement. Now, during the investigation, Paul tells his uncle, Colonel Forsyth, the chief of Scotland Yard, about something he heard about while traveling in the Yucatan about a werewolf, though his uncle doesn't really believe such nonsense. The next night, Wilfred rents a room to lock himself in, but after transformation, he busts out through the window. He enters the zoo and frees a wolf from its enclosure, which distracts the night watchman, who was in the middle of having an affair with another woman other than his wife. Now, Wilfred then attacks the woman and kills her, and on the third night, Yogami visits with Colonel Forsyth to tell him about a werewolf running about. He wants Forsyth to seize the Marifasa plant to basically learn how to grow the plant locally, or there will be an epidemic that will destroy London. Meanwhile, Wilfred goes to Lisa's family's home and asks the caretaker to lock him inside a room. But that night, Lisa and Paul arrive to look around the old family home before he goes back to California. Wilfred tries to attack, but Paul fights him off, while also recognizing Lisa's husband as being the beast that attacked. Back in London, a maid in Yogami's hotel turns up dead. So this leads to Forsyth and Paul basically seeing that there are probably two werewolves running about. The police start looking for Wilfred, who hides in his lab. Yogami attempts to steal the final blossoms of the Marifasa. The two men fight. Wilfred transforms and kills Yogami. He then attempts to attack Lisa, while Paul and Forsyth rush to the Glendon Manor. And before Wilfred can attack and kill Lisa, Forsyth arrives and shoots him. Before dying, Wilfred thanks Forsyth and apologizes to Lisa for not being a better husband. He dies and reverts to his human self. So let's talk about three things I like about Werewolf of London. First, I like Henry Hull's performance as Dr. Glendon. There is a darkness to him that kind of reminds me of something like Dr. Frankenstein from the original 1931 film. He seems more interested in his science than his wife. So much so, he doesn't really seem to care that one of his wife's old boyfriends is hanging around a lot and maybe catching a lot of her attention. Now, he clearly doesn't like Paul after finding out that Paul doesn't really ask for anything more out of life. And he also tells Lisa at one point that he has heard all the stories of childhood memories he cares to hear right in front of Paul. And later still, he tries forbidding Lisa from going out after sundown with Paul, partly to prevent her from being easy for him to get to if he transforms. But he's generally growing colder. Prior to that, albeit jokingly, she jokes around about how she thought that he would divorce her if it meant that he could do more of his botany work. But he says that he will not only divorce Lisa, but he will beat her as well. So that's there naturally to foreshadow the fact that werewolves in the version of this legend will attack those they love the most. But his darker personality, again, kind of like Frankenstein or maybe the Invisible Man, is there. So the scientist is too focused on some sort of breakthrough without even considering the consequences. That's pretty classic stuff in the more gothic realm of horror. Next, I like the use of the werewolf legend in this movie. I like that he has to kill someone in order to transform back into human form. That actually raises some stakes. It also makes the werewolf somewhat conflicted, right? I mean, like, he has no choice but to turn into a werewolf, and the werewolf really likes to kill. But the human also wants to become, well, human again. So he not only needs to kill, he wants to kill to be human again. Plus, I like the fact that the human remembers and knows what will happen at every cycle of the full moon. Whereas the Wolfman comes off as more of a mindless animal. These werewolves in Werewolf of London have some intelligence, cunning, and a good sense to wear a hat and coat when they leave the house to go on their murder spree. Now, third, I really like Jack Pierce's minimalist look of the werewolf in this movie. Sure, he wanted a more full werewolf look, and he does do that later with the Wolfman. But he was told for this movie to kind of dial it back, and I think it looks really great. It feels more realistic as it harkens back to the concept of a feral person being identified a werewolf or lycanthrope back in the old legends. Probably where the legend originated was somebody who was a little bit more feral, a little bit more hairy, didn't groom himself quite the same way as most people do. That makes a lot of sense here to really kind of also show off that dichotomy of, yeah, that really is a person in there, but he's also acting like an animal. Not to mention, Henry Hull also has a great face for the beast as well. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky as well. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Mondays podcast at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload this stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we're going to look at the feature film debut of a character whose origins come from viral internet videos. I'm going to be talking about Onyx the Fortuitous and the Talisman of Souls. So until next week, stay spooky.